On February 6, 2005, Stan Smith would hop out of bed and say "Good morning, USA" for the very first time. The second full-fledged series, created by Seth MacFarlane, tells the story of Stan, a CIA agent, Francine, his wife, their kids, Steve and Haley, Haley's on and off boyfriend Jeff, and Klaus, their pet goldfish with the mind of a German man trapped inside of it, and who could forget Roger the Alien. Your classic family dynamic that would go on to be the 9th longest running American scripted series of all time, and the 3rd longest American animated show, running behind only The Simpsons and Family Guy. And yet, you really don't hear a ton of people talk about this show. So how has it lasted this long? What makes the show so memorable to the people that do watch it? And what is the overall appeal of American Dad? So with over 300 episodes, 18 seasons, and too many Roger personas to count, I'm gonna take a look from season to season, from the Fox to the TBS eras, and see why American Dad has lasted so long and is such a classic. This is American Dad in Review. I know I hyped the series a lot just in the intro, but it should be said I am a bit of a biased reviewer. Personally, I love the show. I didn't when it first came out, but it definitely grew on me like it did most of America. And I'll be honest, I've rewatched the show quite a few times, but of all the seasons, the first one is actually probably the one I watched the least. When American Dad first started, it was very much a critique of the political environment in a post-9/11 America. It was an important commentary and satire for the time, but with any idea like this, some of those comments haven't aged well. And yet in the first season, there are our first inklings of that magic formula that the series will develop over time. Where other series of the time would fall off due to their commentary wearing thin, like Little Bush. Remember Little Bush? American Dad knew when to pivot into something else. Unfortunately, that's just not in this season. But despite how dated some of these episodes may feel, there's still a ton of potential here to appreciate. Also, I thought we had more time before we had to talk about two of probably the most problematic episodes the series has ever produced, but we'll get there. We'll survive, we'll get through it, and I promise it gets better. Also, we're going to be going by the Hulu release of these seasons rather than the box sets, because technically, the first season would only be the first 7 episodes, and the second season would be a much heartier 16. And it really won't be an issue again until we get into the TBS era, where the ideas of seasons gets a little complicated. So you get a heartier 23 episode run right out the gate, and we will look at where the series was at the original season 1 conclusion, but I feel it has a more complete conclusion with the quote-unquote season 2 finale as a stopping point. So grab your pecan sandies, mix a Roy Rogers, and enjoy. It's a pilot. I will say the newspaper gags at the start of the episodes are a fun touch that I admittedly do miss, but they'll be replaced by something a little more evergreen as the series goes on. However, the series opens with the family around the kitchen table and sets up the dynamics incredibly well. Haley being in community college and Steve being... Okay. Steve is pretty weird in the pilot, and you can tell Scott Grimes hadn't perfected the voice just yet. Klaus is uncomfortable, and it's also D. Bradley Baker is still figuring out how to play a German fish. That being said, Seth and Rachel MacFarlane nail the voices for Stan, Roger, and Haley respectively, and Wendy Shaw plays Francine perfectly. Her delivery is seriously one of the strongest of the series right out the gate, and she never really slows down. No matter what situation Francine is in or how she's told to play the character, she nails it every single time. They also set up that Roger saved Stan in Area 51, and now he lives in their attic under the constant fear that if Stan's work found out about him, they'd all get arrested and Roger would probably end up dissected. It's actually a really clever twist on, say, the old ALF formula. There is a reason for Roger to don his personas, but also gives him the freedom to still be an alien, and that will be important later on. They also show off how Haley is very anti-war and quote-unquote liberal compared to her hyper-conservative father. Yet despite this, he still loves his daughter, and you get the feeling that they're a family unit. She's not like Meg, where the whole family objectively hates her, and that's a very important note. No matter how much the family may disagree in some episodes, you never feel like they hate each other or wouldn't defend one another. It's subtle, but that feeling is still there in the pilot. Also, Scott Grimes may still be figuring out the voice, but the more jarring thing is the animators are still nailing down Steve's design. He's a weird little noodle boy in the pilot, and it can be very distracting, but that's pretty quickly rectified. The pilot also uses cutaways like Family Guy did, and they would later go the way of the dodo. But for now, they're fine. They're dated, they could deter people from enjoying the show, but they're fine. They definitely felt like pushing the envelope more than traditional jokes. Stan, also unlike other animated dads, isn't stupid. He may be tone-deaf, bullheaded, and overly confident, but he's still a CIA agent, and they showcase that perfectly, even if the CIA is treated and shown as a sort of boys' club. We also get our first introduction to Steve's best friends, Snot, Barry, and Toshi, who, while they'll get more growth later on, are pretty fleshed out in their identities from the get-go. They're just 4 loser nerds, and they shine because of it. Stan decides to get Steve a dog to try and impress the girls because Steve's contemplating joining the military, and yeah, he gets a dog alright. And then Stan proceeds to accidentally put it down. They also revealed that Klaus was an Olympic skier, and despite it being a cutaway, it would actually be part of the canon, weirdly enough. Jeff is also introduced in the pilot, and fun fact, Jeff Fisher is voiced by, get this, Jeff Fisher. That's neat, right? Man, you guys are gonna have so many Snapple facts by the end of this. Stan also, in an attempt to get his son Steve a date, kidnaps Hilary Duff, and he's just so desperate that he's willing to corrupt a student election to make Steve president just so that he can get a girl. The pilot would also give us one of the best characters in the whole show, Principal Lewis, played by the infinitely talented and vastly underappreciated Kevin Michael Richardson. You want to talk quality? You want to talk one of the best actors of the modern age? It's Kevin Michael Richardson. The man is an absolute legend, and he has no reason to go so hard on a character that should otherwise have been forgotten, but his performance causes this big character to become a major player as the show ages. Truly, the man needs all the Oscars, Emmys, Tonys, Saturn Awards, and Nickelodeon's Kids' Choice Awards the world can throw at him. He's a legend that's probably voiced some of your favorite characters from when you were a kid, and he's been an institution in American Dad from the very beginning. Anyway, Steve goes mad with power as the student class president, going so far as to replace periods with the word Steve, just because he can. The subplot, the B-plot as it were, has Roger writing papers for Haley in exchange for junk food as he gets put on a diet and eventually gets lost in the sauce as it were. It's fine. It shows how lazy Haley is and how Roger will do anything to get what he wants. Anyway, Steve locks the school down after his new girlfriend refuses to kiss him, and Stan fears that he might be gay. Like I said, the series is 17 years old at the time of writing this. It's got some growing to do. It's all about understanding the context of the time it came out. Francine also delivers an absolutely mortifying monologue about having a crush on her algebra teacher that shows that behind her usual smiling demeanor, there's definitely more to Francine to explore than meets the eye. Stan decides to fix Steve's issue by deporting his girlfriend's entire family with one phone call, and again, I cannot emphasize this enough, different time. Eventually, Steve gets Roger's help to get a date in exchange for Twinkies, and after Roger shoots his goo, the pilot ends. All in all, for a pilot, it's honestly one of the strongest episodes of the entire first season. The writing is terrific, the jokes are sharp, and the dialogue just feels super fluid. Other than, again, the dated commentary, which will go away with time, the pilot is a solid example of the potential the show had and how it was willing to challenge the usual status quo. While there were other shows like Oblongs or Mission Hill that tried to do something different and barely lasted a season, American Dad would find that golden groove to teeter on between traditional and absurd. I'm definitely not going to go this in depth on every episode, but it's important to understand the pilot and the initial concept as we head into the rest of the series. This is how the show was pitched to America. This is what we were promised, and the rest of it is how the show was delivered. The first episode after the pilot, Threat Levels, opens with our first introduction to longtime co-anchors and gay partners, Greg and Terry, who will become series staples and as the show goes on, some of the strongest characters in the show. They announce that the terror level has gone down. Some background for this. After 9/11, America would regularly broadcast about the terror level, or the threat of an attack on American soil, with red being a higher threat level and blue being a lower level with a spectrum in between. This was usually talked about on the world news and was part of the breaking news cycle that would go on to be a mainstay of news media going forward, though over time, threat levels as a whole would be talked about less and less. They still exist today, but they're much less reported on, as they usually stoked unnecessary fear. Anyway, back to the show. With the threat level dropping, the CIA relaxes just a bit, and Stan brings home a thermos with a biohazard label, drinks from it, and the family gets put on lockdown. They're given 24 hours to live, and Haley was outside. This is when Haley runs in to try and be with her family, and Steve blows into the suit, infecting her and dooming her to unalive too. Roger also begins to plan a massive renovation of the house after the Smiths are no longer alive, as he is immune to human diseases. They watch the first season of 24 on DVD, which was a show at the time that, you guessed it, takes 24 hours to go through the first season. Turns out the virus was inert and they were all going to survive. Now that they know they're going to survive, Francine begins to feel unfulfilled, and she decides to become a real estate agent a whole 2 years before King of the Hill had Peggy do it, and 6 years after The Simpsons did it. She sells the house across the way from the Smiths to Greg and Terry, and Stan does not take it well. Not because they're gay, but because they're reporters, members of the liberal media. Minor note, this is the first appearance of Dick and the rest of the CIA crew who pop up from time to time. Stan begins to feel emasculated when Francine starts earning more than him as an agent, while Steve and his friends try to make Girls Gone Wild videos so that they can get their game station. Stan hangs out with Greg and Terry and decides to shut down the real estate agency. Steve fails on the porn front and decides to film bum fights. Stan hears Steve and Haley fighting over the homeless shelter turned bum fighting ring and decides to step in to make it a proper bum fighting ring so that he can make more money than Francine and maintain his idea of masculinity. However, when the homeless unionize, he has to fight the man with no name to maintain the sport. The episode also ends with Stan respecting that Francine wants to work and learning how to accept her success, and then immediately sabotaging the entire jobs market to get her out of her job. Threat levels really has nothing to do with the threat levels at the start of the episode, and is really just Stan feeling threatened by the change in the status quo, which is admittedly very smart. It's a fine episode, but it doesn't really rise above the sum of its parts. No one really grows, and ultimately, it's an episode you could watch and immediately forget, but it isn't a waste of time. It's a solid 6 out of 10. It's a Stan and Haley episode. Haley dyes her hair and Stan tells her to change it or to listen to him, and that's the episode. Haley not listening to Stan, and Stan takes drastic measures. It's the first episode where we see Roger trying on wigs, so that's neat. The B story has Steve and the gang looking for dates for their Aloha dance. While Barry still sounds off, Scott Grimes has really cemented the Steve voice and really starts to shine. Jeff gets invited to dinner to meet Stan and Francine, and they have a good time before Stan abducts Haley from a house party. Haley runs away from home and moves in with Jeff, who lives in his van. Steve has Roger pretend to be his sister as a burn victim to get a girlfriend. Haley works at a strip joint to try and cover her $85 community college tuition, and when Stan runs into her dancing while going to lunch with his coworkers, he freaks out. Stan and Jeff fight to get her back. Ultimately, Stan and Haley have a new mutual respect for one another, and while he gives her more room, still has the CIA surveil her while she's on a date. Stan Knows Best is a necessary episode for this kind of character dynamic, and has been done time and time again. It's fine. Unlike threat levels, it just kind of treads water until the end and just feels like padding. Its only real merit is the proper introduction of Jeff and Roger wearing wigs. It's a 5 out of 10. Stan forgets his anniversary and instead goes on a fishing trip. And Jeff tries to get Haley to go to Burning Man. Fun fact, this is actually the first appearance of Sir Patrick Stewart as Avery Bullock, the director of the CIA and Stan's boss. And the B story is Steve getting a date, if he can find a date, for the girl's friend, Jewel. Stan remembers the anniversary too late and takes Francine to the CIA to wipe her memory. However, instead of erasing the last 20 hours, they erase the last 20 years of her memory. And so she forgets who Stan is, and they have to fall in love all over again. They recreate her old life, and yeah, that's the story. It's kinda nice to see how they first got together and how Francine was a wild party girl compared to Stan still being an upright CIA agent even back then, but that's about it. They run over a raccoon, he mercy unalives it, they fell in love, bing bang boom, that's the story. Haley drives her younger mom around and Stan tries to recreate that scene with an adorable, unkillable raccoon and fails miserably. Steve gets Roger to pose as a friend to get Jewel a date, and it's actually the first time Roger goes out in a disguise, which is incredibly basic compared to what we get later on. The date does not go well. Stan hunts down Francine, who is throwing a rager, while Haley tries to keep her rebel mom in line. Jeff ends up taking Francine to Burning Man, and Haley and Stan go to get them back. Klaus tags along. Roger gets found out as an alien and knocks both Jewel and Steve's girlfriend out, and they eventually will erase their memories. Stan saves Francine from a literal Burning Man, and she gets her memory back through shock. I guess it's more background on Jeff. It was nice to see Stan and Francine's origin story, but again, the episode was vapid and forgettable. You have to remember, this is the first season, and they're still figuring things out, which is why the next episode hits so much harder. This episode was an okay 6 out of 10, but it leads directly into... That's right, it's Roger Codger. The episode opens on Stan on a top secret mission where we see him being incredibly competent on a test course, showing that again, he's not a bumbling idiot, just unaware. Anyway, his course time was beaten by a new agent named Duper. Stan decides to host Deputy Director Bullock for dinner to get on his good side, and it's actually the first time we learn Bullock's wife is being held hostage in Fallujah. Patrick Stewart is absolutely hamming it up in this role, and you can tell he's having fun with it. Stan shows Duper eating a falafel, and Bullock loves his attempts at sabotage. Stan struggles to keep Roger away from Director Bullock, resulting in the director slipping on Roger's goo and hurting his back. Stan lashes out at Roger for not caring and being lazy, and wishes that Roger was gone. Roger expels goo and collapses on the ground completely unresponsive, and Stan thinks he's dead, so he dumps his body in a burger joint dumpster. When Roger comes to at the dump, he comes up with his first proper disguise. We also get the first introduction of Father Donovan, played by the legendary Martin Mull, as Francine begins to question her faith when he tells her pets like Roger won't get into heaven. Roger gets mistaken for an old woman and is put on a retirement home bus headed for a tour of DC with Gertie. We get a flashback to how Roger saved Stan at Area 51 when Stan realized Roger didn't actually pose a threat to anyone and had been living on Earth for decades before he got caught. Roger could have run off, but instead threw Stan down the chute to save him, and then they brought Roger into his home. Stan begins to feel regret for dumping his body and decides to fix it when he discovers Roger is alive and well in Washington, D.C. The family finds Roger, and he says he's ready to sacrifice himself for the family, which shows how much he cares, and as the CIA is about to bang down the door, they replace him with Gertie and help Roger escape to live with the family once more, which helps Francine believe in God yet again. All in all, it's probably the strongest episode since the pilot and shows that they were willing to take a gamble on Roger having his own story, and it paid off. It's also the first time we effectively see not only an A and B story, but also a C and a somewhat D story as well. We do have the conflict of Stan being considered a lady or weak for having emotions, juxtaposed with Roger touring DC and running from the CIA, but we also get Francine losing her faith and very briefly have Steve having Klaus as a faux father figure. They're smaller, almost vignettes, but they do tie back to the original story, and ultimately I'd say this is the episode that is the best early realization of American Dad formula that would come into existence. A very, very strong 8 out of 10. It's the first introduction of Tuttle! He's played by acting icon Richard Kind! Tuttle is a treasure. Anyway, Francine wants to throw a house party to interact with her neighbors, but is afraid of Stan going full CIA on them, and proceeds to go full CIA on them when he finds out that the new neighbors are Iranian. Look, it was 2005. It gets better, I promise, but yeah, he tries to strip search the Mamaris. The B story involves Steve joining Ranger Scouts, and we see the first time Seth Green would guest star on the series. Turns out the Ranger Scouts smoke, drink, and party, and Steve falls in love with it. Steve accidentally lights a gazebo on fire, causing Stan to freak out and think the Mamaris are attacking everyone when they're just eating burgers. Steve feels guilty about the gazebo and tries to leave the Scouts when he finds out they'll unalive him if he does. There's a C story of Roger trying to see if he's got any powers, which is also kind of there, with Klaus assisting, but it's just kind of okay, and it doesn't really go anywhere until it becomes one of the most important scenes in all of American Dad. Anyways, Stan goes to jail for racially profiling, gets out, and then proceeds to lock all of his neighbors up under 24/7 surveillance at a pool party in his backyard. Weirdly enough, I think this is the first time we actually see their backyard and that they have a pool. It's kinda neat. I guess the one positive of this episode is that all of Stan's behavior is seen as outrageous, and they don't shy away from showing he's in the wrong. Francine and Haley are both emboldened by the entire neighborhood to free the Mamaris, and Francine even goes out of her way to turn it into a pool party to try and downplay the active hostage situation. And in the end, Stan does seem somewhat remorseful, but until that point, it is a bit of an uncomfortable watch. However, after Steve and Roger blow out the electrical grid from crashing into it, we find out what Roger's special power is. He lays golden gem-encrusted turds that drive otherwise good people insane. It really is a shame that the first Golden Turd episode is Homeland Insecurity, so I can't even recommend skipping the episode because it's so imperative to the Golden Turd storyline. Which is a sentence that if I had even an ounce of self-respect, I wouldn't say. Only American Dad can make a Golden Turd compelling television, and it's wild. None of the bit is taken as a joke, and that's what makes it so funny. You have an electrical worker that unalives his best friend and steals the turd only to run off and find out his wife was cheating on him, all sandwiched between the actual plot of the episode. It almost feels like they knew they needed something to hook the audience again, and admittedly the second half of the episode is a lot stronger when Haley and Francine turn the torture into a pool party, and Stan thinks he was brainwashed into destroying the electrical grid and starts torturing himself in the shed. The episode is overall pretty rough and a product of its time, but even despite all that, it tries to end on a satirical and sharp turn. The show is still trying to find its stride, and again, while I wish I could say skip it, the Golden Turd persists through all 300 plus episodes of the series and is integral to the overall show. It's a 3 out of 10, saved only by the turd. Remember how I said this had 2 of the worst episodes in the series? The worst part? This isn't even one of them. It's a church episode. Stan is in competition with his neighbor and races him to church every week. We also find out Francine wants to kill George Clooney. That's neat. After the deacon chokes on communion, Stan begins to compete with his neighbor for the position that he didn't even want until his neighbor showed that he was interested. Meanwhile, Roger is going through his reproductive cycle, causing him to lactate. Yeah, this is an episode. Francine decides to make potato salad for the wake and Roger eats it all. In a panic, Roger makes a replacement and they're all out of mayo. And you can see where this is going. So yeah, it's Roger's breast milk in the potato salad. Aren't you glad this is the quote-unquote season finale? Stan Smith hires Karl Rove to help him win the deacon election and a wolf howls every time his name is said. Stan begins to milk Roger for potato salad. This was animated. Still not the worst episodes. I guess in a plus, it's still not great, but it's not like overtly offensive. D. Bradley Baker also starts to lock down the voice of Klaus, so it starts to balance out. The B story has Steve dating Betsy, the daughter of Stan's neighbor Chuck, while Roger is force-fed and milked also Stan can win deaconship. A job, again, he didn't even want. Roger collapses after choking and Steve gives him CPR. Steve, after giving Roger CPR, ends up getting pregnant with an alien spawn. Stan struggles to figure out what to do, and they end up going to Mexico. After coming back, Steve kisses Betsy and is no longer pregnant. Betsy becomes the new alien host and moves away to Iowa, while Stan pretends to be possessed to lose the deacon position. I guess in like one positive of this does introduce Molly Shannon as a recurring character who does play Chuck's wife. It's nice, I guess. It's kind of neat. It's just I wish she was used on a better scenario than this. Yeah, this episode is 100% skippable. This is just, there's nothing there. The jokes haven't aged well, it doesn't have any real story importance, and it's just a miss on almost every character. Francine shines surprisingly well, and I think that's just Wendy Schaal crushing it like usual. Steve obviously gets the short end of the stick, and ultimately it's just, yeah, it's a lot, but like a lot of nothing. I had potato salad for lunch before watching this episode just because I didn't remember, and I have never regretted a decision more. This was rough. And so that's it. That would have been season 1. What a roller coaster. And regardless of how you feel about Deacon Stan Jesus Man, you have to admit it's a pretty weird place to end a season. Even just switching it and Homeland Insecurity so the season finale lined up with the start of the Golden Turd epic, which still feels weird to say, would have probably been the better route to go. And hey, you may have loved these episodes, and that's totally cool. It's just like a disclaimer, everyone's going to like different episodes, and there's a personal charm to a lot of them that makes some resonate to people more than others. I know my favorite episodes are definitely not going to be everyone else's favorites, but even so, just these 7 episodes, we're nowhere close to the actual end. We're not even a third of the way into the season, and in all honesty, other than one significant dip, this second chunk is full of some incredibly funny American Dad. And hey, if you're enjoying it so far, consider subscribing or joining the Discord. We're always looking to meet new people. And so, without further ado, let's jump into the second half, or what could be considered the other second season. Admittedly, I'm embarrassed I'm just now talking about this and not back in threat levels, especially since I mentioned King of the Hill, but Dick is by and far one of the best supporting characters in the whole show, and it's in large part to the always terrific performance done by Stephen Root, who is an absolute legend. You'd probably recognize him as Bill or Buck Strickland in King of the Hill, or as Barry's handler in, well, Barry. Anyway, a fantastic actor that I just need to call out for a moment. This episode sees the deputy director leaving the CIA due to terminal cancer, and Stan is determined to get his job. I appreciate that the Duper conflict isn't really played out throughout the season or anything, and it's really just the one time the other agent is mentioned as a rival for Stan, despite him still being around the office. They seem to have found a coexistence that I appreciate. Stan is sent to get Bullock's dry cleaning while Jeff and Haley go on a breakup hike so Haley can pursue a more challenging partner. The family goes to the CIA carnival, and honestly, it has some of the strongest sight gags of the season. This is where Haley decides to challenge Avery and throw quips. Klaus also has a nice little bit where throughout the episode he does DVD commentary, and it's just great. The B story is Steve and Roger taking Dick Cheney's BlackBerry and using it to prank world leaders. It's admittedly the best B story so far, and it really lands. While they're doing that, Stan makes a surprise visit to Bullock's to show how determined he is to get the promotion, and that's when he runs into a half-naked Haley. That's right, it's a Haley and Avery episode. Haley and Avery start to sleep together, and Bullock is more than happy to talk promotion with Stan so long as he's cool with it. Meanwhile, Jeff loses it, but is still the passive stoner he's always been. Stan decides to train Jeff to be more assertive and dominant to win back his daughter's love. So he ties him to a post and tortures him until he stands up for himself. They also made some surprisingly evergreen comments about Joe Rogan, which I kind of appreciated. Also, Patrick Stewart's singing is just the best. The beat story with Roger and Steve is just the absolute best and really shows that the writers figured out how to do one of the best dynamics in the show. Well, where you had Peter and Brian and then Stewie and Brian in Family Guy, in American Dad you really have this revolving door where all roads will eventually end at Roger. But the strongest pairings are usually Stan and Roger, Francine and Roger, and of course the boy and his alien, Steve and Roger. The way they play off each other is phenomenal, and this is our first real showcase of what that looks like when it really works. Haley then proceeds to dump Bullock over the phone live on C-SPAN TV in what is probably the funniest scene in the show yet, and Avery promises Stan his promotion if he unalives Jeff. Meanwhile, Argentina star 69 Steve and Roger, which is both hilarious and hilariously dated. Avery and Stan start to hunt Jeff in the woods, and he steals the SUV to get away. They make their way to a diner where Avery proceeds to throw Jeff through a booth, but when Avery insults Haley, Stan snaps and they go straight giant chicken fight, while Klaus narrates it again like it's DVD commentary. Bullock pretends that he staged the diner fight just to get away, and I don't even have a witty commentary here, it's just incredible. When he's coughing up blood on the waitress and then hurls himself through a glass window, it's amazing. It really is. The episode ends with an in-loving memory of Tran Jimmy Ng, the character they'd mentioned earlier on. There's been some reports that an animator actually knew an officer named Tran Jimmy Ng who died in a car accident, but I can't really find anything that 100% validates it. If it's true, that's really wholesome and sweet, and if it isn't and it's just there for the gag, it's really clever. Overall, this is by and far the best episode of the season so far. An easy 9 out of 10. And if you're not hooked on the story or the character after watching Bullocks to Stan, you're probably not going to enjoy the show at all. Patrick Stewart is incredible, and it legitimately feels like the writers understand the characters and how they want to write them moving forward. Basically, if you want to get someone into the show that's never seen it before and want to show them some of the first season's charm, show them Bullocks to Stan. The episode opens with a Simple Life parody. The Simple Life was a show on Fox that followed Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie, two socialites, as they interacted with normal everyday people. The early 2000s was a wild west of reality TV. Why am I bringing this up? Well, that's because this episode is about Stan discovering the joys of... Steve comes to Stan with a permission slip for him to sign so he can take sex ed, and Stan decides he should teach Steve sex ed instead. And when Steve brings up self-gratification, Stan shows him a scare film. The B story is a much more interesting plot. Roger is going to get his bartending license. This would actually be the start of Roger's Place, which would be an institution of later episodes. Steve, trying to combat his urges, takes up woodworking with his dad, and after using a hot poker, accidentally stabbing through the wood into his dad's poker, which causes him to be injured and needs a special cream to take care of his new burn, and yeah, you see where this is going. Moderation matters is the moral of the story. There's not a ton to talk about in this episode, and to try and not get age restricted, I'm not gonna get into the nitty gritty of it, but the TLDR is Stan gets addicted, blames TV, takes over the TV station, and puts on clean programming, before giving the Steve the talk on broadcast television and basically retconning everything other than, again, Roger's Place. It's not a bad episode, and it does have some solid jokes, but overall, it's just okay. It's like a 6.5 out of 10. Now this is a good episode. Stan has to hunt a cyber bad guy who leaves notes in what they think is Elvish, but when you see it, it's very obviously hiragana, a form of Japanese alphabet. But for the sake of this episode, it's Elvish. Anyway, Stan can't translate it, but Steve can. And so Stan has to learn from his son and his friends' nerdy ways. It's our first real look at Barry, Snot, and Toshi as characters and how they work as foils to Steve. Stan wants Steve to be more manly and play in the father-son baseball game, but when he sees he's horrible at sports, he finds a pro to replace him. It's the first in a long line of episodes of Stan having to come to terms with Steve being a nerd, and honestly, it's a pretty strong first showing of that idea. Yeah, it's going to be a frequently reused trope, but it makes sense for the characters to have that constant clash. He still loves Steve, but he also wants him to be more like him, or as we'll later find out, more like how he wanted to be. The B story focuses on Roger getting a job to interact with people by being a Jumbo Juice mascot and handing out coupons until he runs into the Taco King, who proceeds to beat him up and down the block. I don't want to give too much of the episode away, but it really is phenomenal, with a special guest appearance by Stephen Colbert and the antagonist being named Dan Weber, who is actually one of the writers on the show. There's a lot to really love about this episode, and it cements that formula we've seen starting to take shape since Bullocks to Stan. It's a healthy 8.5 out of 5, and a solid first season outing that honestly, yeah, you've seen the episode idea before, but how it's handled is just terrific. Just another final brief aside, while most people may know Stephen Colbert exclusively from his run on The Colbert Report or Late Night, he did actually used to do a fair share of voice acting, and his role as Phil Ken Sebin in Harvey Birdman is easily one of the best characters Adult Swim ever produced. I should probably talk about Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law at some point, since it's also just incredible. Should I have reviewed the 36 episode series before the one with over 300? Probably. The CIA says Stan's a family man and can't take on dangerous missions anymore. Stan tries to prove he's still a dangerous agent when he plants a bomb in Bullock's office, but when he panics at the last minute, the office is saved by Duper, which just shows how effective Duper is, even if he's not being focused on. When his quote-unquote dad dies suddenly, his real father, Jack, reappears in his life as a super spy. The B story follows Steve cleaning out his fake dead grandpa's apartment and runs into his old neighbor, who he begins to make out violently with. And after telling his friends, Snot also goes to meet up with her. It's an episode. It's the first but definitely not the last appearance of Jack, and spoiler, Jack is not a good guy. He basically tricks Stan into robbing a museum with him and runs off. It's fine. There isn't much to talk about in this episode since it's a pretty cut and dry story that really doesn't have a ton of jokes. It really just focuses on the Jack and Stan story. Though there's a part where Stan beats up a museum security guard that's just... it's just pretty great. Fun fact, Jack is actually voiced by Darren Norris, who you'd probably recognize as Timmy Turner's dad and Cosmo in Fairly Odd Parents, or in a more obscure role, the narrator from Street Fighter 2V. Look, this is an anime channel. I'm gonna at least mention Street Fighter 2V at least once. Overall, it's fine. It's like a 6 out of 10. Okay, so we're here. Remember how I said there were 2 bad episodes to the season? Well, here they are. Stan of Arabia Part 1 and 2 are just... yeah, we'll get into it. Stan and his co-workers have to plan a birthday party for their boss Avery Bullock. Stan forgets Francine has a play on the same day as his birthday, and when he forbids her from doing it, she walks off in a rage. And after Haley sees the newest Michael Moore movie where he's sold out, see, I told you, super dated episodes. She believes there's no more integrity in America. Francine skips the birthday saying that marriages are an equal partnership, the audacity. Then Stan unalives Jay Leno. It's a wild 5 minutes just to get to the meat of the episode. Anyway, Stan now has to roast his boss instead of Jay Leno, and it goes as well as you'd think. Weirdly enough, it keeps the canon of the series though, even mentioning that his wife is still a hostage in Fallujah, and his preference for chubby Asian women, which, and I can't believe I'm saying this, will come up later on in later seasons. Plural. Stan gets tossed out, and this is where we get our first song of the series. Is it the best song of the series? No, we're not there. We're not there yet. But we'll get there, I promise. Yeah, this is a 2-parter, which is also one of only a handful of 2-parters in the entire series. And it's a weird pseudo-musical about Stan wishing his wife was more subservient and less of an independent woman, despite the fact she's already a stay-at-home mom. Alright, so I feel like this is kind of the perfect place to talk about this, because there's not a whole lot more to talk about across the 2 episodes, but this is a perfect example of Stan being the active antagonist of the episode. Homer or Peter usually cause issues because of their bumbling shenanigans, not their overt biases. Stan is a smart man. We're shown this several times throughout the series. He's a competent agent most of the time and has a very almost obnoxious confidence. While they will dial down the politics and his heavy conservative leanings as the show goes on, just like how they flesh out the rest of the family, there's still a trend of Stan very much being the antagonist of quite a few episodes, and it actually kinda works. Whether it's bullying his own son or sabotaging Roger, while on paper these sound like horrible things to do, from a writing and character perspective, it 100% works as something Stan would do or Stan would think. You're given so many episodes to relate to or appreciate who Stan is, but there's always that barrier where you're reminded that, hey, he's not a perfect guy. He still carries some of his weird stances and overall is pretty insufferable sometimes, which just shows how talented the writers are in writing him. Honestly, as far as likability goes, each character has a swing at being an active or passive antagonist, and it helps build them as a character even if you aren't cheering for them. And what is an active or inactive antagonist? It's pretty simple. A passive antagonist is where that character's actions cause an event that becomes a hurdle for the family, where more often than not, they either don't realize they did it, or they face it with the family to overcome the threat. And an active antagonist is one that throughout the episode or piece of media in general, they're actively going against the rest of the group and fighting back. Can you tell I don't want to talk about these episodes? I just went into a tangent about literary devices, and I don't even read. Anyway, at the end of Stan's song, admittedly there's a really funny joke where a terrified family fears for their life as he finishes singing on top of their dinner table. Like at the end of the day, it's a well-written episode, it's just very much a product of its time. Stan gets a promotion from Bullock for his roast, and he and his family get relocated to Saudi Arabia. The family have to figure out their new lives in Saudi Arabia, with Stan getting a second wife named Thundercat, Roger struggling with living in a dry country, Haley meeting a guy who hints that he's a bad guy, and Steve finds the joys of the bazaar. Stan also gets assigned to protect an oil pipeline. Stan learns of the moral police and how women should be subservient to their husbands in the country, and yeah, This was 2005. Francine tries to leave without Stan and gets taken back immediately. Roger gets sold by Steve to buy a car and grenades. Haley runs with the virtual police, and yeah, it's a lot. By the end of the episode, Stan is enjoying Saudi Arabia. Bullock offers him his job back, and he refuses it right as Steve gets into an accident. Francine is getting her face smashed in by Thundercat. Haley is running through alleys, and Stan lights their passports on fire, renouncing their citizenship. That's just the first part. Part 2 picks up at the end of, we literally just talked about it. He's Stan of Arabia now. He even says he's Stan of Arabia. Steve is stranded in the desert, Roger is sent to be the wife of a sheik, and this is the first time we see a full-on disguise for Roger, but still no persona. Haley finds a guy that she relates to, but he hints that he's a bad guy associated with a certain Middle Eastern organization. Look, it's a musical episode, and you can't expect me to not dance around demonetization. You know what I'm talking about. When Francine finds out that Bullock offered Stan his job back and he refused, she screams and loses it. Roger, living in luxury, is enjoying being able to drink again, and when Francine breaks out into song, she gets arrested by the virtual police. It's really important that Francine does this song because it really shows off her character and just her inherent rebellion. She could have been a very passive wife, but instead she chooses to actually fight for her rights. Roger basically does an Arabian Nights thing to get out of sleeping with their new husband by telling him the plot of 80s and 90s TV shows. Steve is visited by God as they disguise themselves as Angelina Jolie, played by Odile Corso. Haley wakes up to see that the man she slept with is marching to the US Embassy, and when she goes to stop him, she finds out he's not a bad guy, he just works at Shawarma King, and proceeds to beat him up for lying to her. Francine is sentenced to unaliving by stoning and gets taken away. Stan argues that marriage is an equal partnership and asks to be stoned with Francine. Steve becomes a prophet, and when he says that God is a woman, he also gets sentenced to stoning. Haley also gets sentenced, and as they're just about to be taken out, President Bush descends and starts airdropping democracy, and Stan realizes he's about to not live anymore. However, thanks to Roger getting a favor from their husband, they're saved and taken back to America. It ends on a song about how America isn't the worst place in the world, and that's it. That's the end. It's got jokes, it's not without some merit, but overall it's a product of its time, and they never shied away from reminding you that the show is satire. You're supposed to laugh at Stan's views, it's just more beat you over the head in the earlier episodes, and when they dial it down, his actual character starts to shine more through. Overall, it's admittedly not the worst episode or episodes of the season, just the least well-aged. Honestly, all things considered, I think that Deacon Stan Jesus Man is probably the worst episode of all the ones we're going to talk about. Stan has his gun club over, and we actually have the B story set up before the A story. Steve eats Roger's cookie, and he vows revenge. After Terry's car gets broken into, Stan shows off his gun collection, and he and Haley clash over gun control and gun rights. It's a phenomenal episode. I love Stanny Get Your Gun. We're going to go more in depth on it, I promise, but just this is the palate cleanser. This could very well be one of, if not the best episode of this season. The commentary is sharp, the satire is biting, the characters are well done, and the A and B stories are handled just brilliantly. I didn't even rate Stan of Arabia, it'd probably be like a 4 or 5 out of 10 altogether, but this is a solid 9. Did you know paprika is just crushed red pepper? I didn't either. Anyway, it's the same dynamic as Stan Knows Best, with it being a Haley and Stan episode, but the nice thing is, you see that they actively love each other and care about one another, even if they disagree. Anyway, Francine shows off some old videos of Stan and Haley, and Roger comes up with the perfect scheme by convincing Steve he was adopted to get revenge, as he isn't seen in any of those videos. When forced to bond, Stan takes Haley to NGA Land, a gun-themed music park, and it's just terrific. We also get our introduction to Bobby the Bullet. After he riles kids up to take out A.C. Lewis, Haley jumps on a table and starts to sing, enchanting the kids with anti-gun rhetoric. Her display gets them kicked out of the amusement park and Stan's NGA card revoked. Roger then proceeds to burn all of Steve's old childhood photos to push the adoption scheme. Stan then stages a break-in so that when Haley comes in and sees the family tied up, she shoots and thinks she unalived the burglar, only to find out that it was all a setup. When she confronts him, she fires off the blanks, and then when she aims it at her dad and pulls the trigger, an actual bullet fires off and lodges itself in his spine, paralyzing him for life. Haley begins to feel incredibly guilty and starts taking care of her dad for 3 days straight and tricking out his new wheelchair. Stan also tells Haley he wants to be an activist before Steve drops a bookcase on him and makes out with his sister. Stan goes to the NGA and tells them he wants to be a pro-gun activist, and Haley, out of guilt, agrees to sing for them. This sets Bobby the Bullet off as he jumps out the window. Steve goes to meet his birth parents, and Roger reveals he pranked him, as they very real people that were very excited to have their son back watch in horror as Steve absolutely loves the prank, which again just shows that Roger and Steve is one of the best combinations in the whole show. After, Haley sings a song about having Mrs. Claus hostage, and Haley switching to her original song when Stan realizes how much she's compromising her morals just to make him happy, Bobby the Bullet tries to take her out, which causes Stan to take the shot for her, which pushes the old bullet out of his spine and cures his paralyzation, because we have to return to the status quo. However, you really get to see Stan and Haley love and support each other. You can tell they have an actual healthy relationship, unlike, again, Meg and Peter. The episode is absolutely magical. I know I already gave it a 9 out of 10, but I really can't stress enough, this was one of the first episodes that left me dry wheezing and crying out of laughter as a kid. The first season may still be figuring things out, but when they hit highs, man, those are stratospheric highs. You ever see Sunset Boulevard? Probably not. It's a neo-noir crime movie that opens with the main character unalive in a pool. Star Trek opens with what looks like Steve unresponsive in a pool of cherry jello. We then get a flashback that shows us how we got there. Basically, Steve writes a bestseller about Roger as a stupid alien for a kid's book, and his new success has his whole family clamoring for his approval. Like, that's the whole story. It is the first introduction of Mr. Beauregard, voiced by the legendary Leslie Jordan, and he would end up being a recurring character. I'm not going to go in depth on this episode, not because there isn't anything to talk about, but because it's something that needs to be seen to be enjoyed. It's a strong 8.5 out of 10 and really exemplifies how American Dad trusts its audience to get the jokes. And even if you don't get every joke, the more you come back and rewatch, the stronger an episode will become. It's just phenomenal, and even if you weren't forced to study noir cinema and Billy Wilder or their impact on Ernst Lubitsch in college, you can still appreciate the effort that went into it. It also has Bryan Cranston as the book publisher, which would actually be a recurring thing as he guest starred on Family Guy and was a semi-regular on Cleveland Show as well. Another brief aside, as the series goes on, the writers have deviated further and further away from cutaway gags and instead just embraces that life can be nonsensical for this family. They have an alien that lives in their attic and a talking goldfish. They can do anything without cutting to famous person doing random thing. And that's not an attack on Family Guy at all. That formula worked and still works for that show. But American Dad had to differentiate itself, especially with Family Guy's surging popularity in the mid-2000s. 2005 to 2008 really was a golden age for McFarlane's shows, and in a few more seasons you'll find out why. We also get Captain Monty in this episode, so that's nice. He's delightful. He's like if James Lipton worked at a Long John Silver's. Francine is tired of doing everything the same way every week and runs into the Ladybugs with her friend Linda Mamari, which is the first time we've seen her since Home Insecurity. The Ladybugs are very much a foil on the Desperate Housewives idea, which was a show at the time, and when a woman is found not alive, Francine takes that woman's dog to play with. The B story is about Steve finding and reading Haley's journal and her locking him and Klaus in the closet. When Francine brings home the small dog, the C story begins, where Stan actually starts to bond with it once it runs back home and survives the harrows of the concrete jungle. Francine would go on to go to the art gallery and ends up in a closet with a valet, which makes the ladies think that she had an affair, making her Ladybug material. And Francine decides to go all in and becomes a member of the Ladybugs while coming up with more and more crazy affair ideas. Small note, but it's also the first appearance of Les Pantalons Fancy, which will be a recurring restaurant throughout the series. There's not really anything else to talk about this episode. Francine betrays Linda's trust by hanging out with the ladybugs. Roger eats dog treats to get Fussy to like him over Stan to mess with him for the B or C story. And yeah, Steve and Klaus are still locked in the closet. The ladybugs unalive former members, and Fussy was owned by a former ladybug. It's fine, it's like a 7 out of 10, and ultimately if you don't enjoy it, that's okay. It's something I like to call a floater episode. It doesn't have anything that makes it inherently stand out, but it's not bad by any means. It's fine. Katie is voiced by Sandra Oh, so that's kinda neat, and Molly Shannon does return for her character as well, and I mean, they're both always great. Haley rescues a monkey from a lab while Stan and Roger start to fight about how Roger broke his TV. After Stan bungles a weapons demonstration due to the aforementioned monkey stealing his weapons manual, ends up without a job, and the Mamaris overhear him yelling at Roger thinking it's Francine. Linda also reveals she's into Francine, which was hinted at in the previous episode. It's an interesting idea, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Roger also gets a disguise to take Stan to the Big Buy to get a new TV. They get into an accident and Stan ends up on house arrest, and that gives us the big reveal of the episode. Stan basically ends up becoming Roger, and Roger has to go out and get a job and actually starts to wear real disguises, starting our steady descent into Roger's personas. Obviously, people get the wrong idea and think Stan is abusive and a horrible individual, and this is where people start going, "He is!" But you know, more so than usual. And it teaches Roger the importance of work and how hard it is to make it. He teams up with a car salesman played by Andy Richter, who is also just fantastic. Sort in the same vein as Star Trek, there's not a ton that should be said, and I will say if you are uncomfortable with domestic situations, feel free to skip this episode. While it is used as a joke, it can be triggering for some people, and that's okay. All in all, it's an effective episode that has a lot of solid jokes, and it's a pretty decent 7.5 out of 10. When the family goes to a mall after Stan gets a bonus, Francine sees a kiosk for sale and remembers her dream of running a kiosk business and wanting to open a muffin shop. Stan doesn't give her the money for her dream and leaves her devastated. The B story finds Haley trying to protest and sabotage the deforestation behind the mall, where she meets Arborius, the environmentalist who lives in a pot. The C story is Steve and his friends going to see The Soiling, a werewolf movie. And as they're walking at night, a wolf attacks Steve to get his muffins and runs off, and he thinks he's going to turn into a werewolf and has to deal with his upcoming transformation. There's also actually a D story as well about Roger finding the same wolf that attacked Steve and using Francine's muffins to lure him back to the house, and you see what's going on. It's got a lot of different vignettes that overlap at different points, but it finds Francine buying the kiosk behind Stan's back, using some of his bonus to follow her dreams, and she quickly pays him back. I'm not going to break down every element of this episode, but I really want to talk about one thing. After Francine starts working and Stan is given an ultimatum, he has to decide between giving Klaus a body or order out. And he chooses to give Klaus a new body, which he proceeds to use to try and pick up Francine. Surprisingly enough, this is actually the first main plot Klaus is a part of. Especially looking back, it's wild that it wasn't until the 18th episode that he got a focus, but he's a sizable inclusion to the roster of potential narrative characters. The rest of the episode is solid and manages to tell 4 stories concurrently in a great style. It's a strong 8 out of 10. This episode starts with a very interesting turn. We see Stan in high school, and he's the same kind of pimply nerd he judged Steve for being. It may not seem like much, but it's incredibly important from a character standpoint. Take everything we've learned about Stan this season, and it really helps piece together who he is and why he's like that. The flashbacks we get of Stan aren't justifying his stances, but they do explain why he has them. He was the nerd that couldn't get a date to prom, whose dad abandoned him, and he repressed those memories and emotions while taking on an artificially hypermasculine identity through working at the CIA. And that's not even me reading into it that much. It's literally the plot points of previous episodes. And as we've seen, even though it's an episodic show, if you watch it in order, you start to unravel the layers and see how complex the characters are becoming. There may be different interpretations of the characters' past, but they always have the same traits. Francine was always a party girl before she met Stan. Stan was always a nerd before he joined the CIA. And Steve and Haley actually have growth as characters as the story progresses. Even Klaus's history as an Olympic skier isn't isn't forgotten. Literally the only character that doesn't really have that is Roger, and we'll get into why that's okay later on. Broad strokes of it, though, is that with Roger taking on so many different personas, he doesn't need to have that cemented past or interactions. You know his character. He's a drama queen, but still cares for the family in his own way. It'll be revealed later that he's over 1,600 years old, and from a writing perspective, he just has the freedom to be whatever the writers need him to be, whether that be a supporting or antagonistic role to whatever the family are doing that episode. I know I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but it's really neat to see, especially compared to, say, The Simpsons, where backstories have to change every few seasons, or Family Guy, where they largely stay the same and don't have a ton of depth. American Dad invests in the characters and your love/knowledge of them to tell heartier, funnier stories. Anyway, yeah, the episode opens on a flashback of Stan getting bullied at prom and vowing revenge by bringing his homecoming queen in 20 years. We then get a flash forward to them heading to Francine's reunion, where Stan is excited to go and be with the homecoming queen. The B story has Roger and Steve firing water balloons at a pizza delivery guy that is basically just Jesus. Roger proceeds to blow up his car with a mortar, and they proceed to use Francine's car to deliver his pizzas, while Haley, Jeff, and Klaus enjoy some brownies. At the reunion, Francine introduces her best friend, Quacky, who is played by the always fantastic John Cryer, which I'm pretty sure, but not 100% on, is a Pretty in Pink reference, but even if it wasn't, it's still great to hear him. He's a wonderfully talented actor. Anyway, they discover that there were missing votes, and Francine didn't actually win Homecoming Queen, and it was Betty Sue instead. Stan decides to take Betty Sue to the dance instead of Francine because she wasn't Homecoming Queen. And yeah, he learns that it doesn't matter, and he's just happy to be with her. Honestly, the second half of the A story is really rough to watch because it's just, it's Stan giving into his bullied past while having his body double entertain Francine. Ultimately, the whole episode is like a 6, maybe a 5 out of 10. And while it's important for Stan's character, the best parts of the episode are Haley, Jeff, and Klaus eating brownies and Steve interacting with Mitch/Jesus, the pizza delivery guy. That being said, Bill the body double is great, and it won't be the last we even see of him. Roger and Stan go for a wild night out after Stan goes to a bachelor party uninvited and ends up doing a Rogerism, where they share their greatest secrets and learn everything to know about each other through alien magic and will eventually compete in Best Buddies. That's the short and sweet of it. The B story is Steve and Haley working together to break up Steve's crush Trudy from her boyfriend Miles so they can catch them on the rebound. Fun fact, Trudy is played by Jenny Garth and Miles was played by her then husband, Peter Fasinelli. Why am I bringing this up? Because there's not much else to bring up. It's a funny episode, but it just kind of plays the same as Rough Trade, only in that it's Roger and Stan learning more about each other and learning how to get along. It's not the last time, and it's not the first time. It's got a lot of funny moments, and it's definitely worth the watch. And in all fairness, it does play into the idea of Stan struggling to admit he has an actual friend, which comes again from being bullied or being abandoned his whole life and not having that inherently while growing up. It's a neat idea that is handled well. It's also nice to see Steve and Haley getting along and having their own story, even if it's, breaking up a couple for no good reason. It's an 8 out of 10 that is definitely worth the watch. It's also the return of the real estate agent from the Threat Levels episode where her hands got cut off. See? Continuity! It also has special guests Wendy Jo Sieber and Peter Scolari from the show Bosom Buddies. I think this might be my shortest episode review yet. Can you kind of tell I'm burning out? This is the longest season of the entire batch, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, folks. I promise the episode is really terrific and has a ton of quality bits, especially the limo scene, but overall, it's just a blur. After Haley makes a video about her mom, Francine is mortified that she thinks she hasn't done anything with her life and vows to do something to change that. She gets an offshore degree as a doctor and begins to help a disabled group of burglars in their various heists and schemes. The B story is Stan trying to make Steve popular with a super pill, but he gives him giant breasts instead. Look, remember how I said you could skip Deacon Stan Jesus Man? You can skip this one too. It's Stan trying to live vicariously through Steve and Francine trying to look impressive to Haley. It's like a 4 out of 10. It's kind of funny, but overall it's a forgettable nothing episode. It's not as bad as Deacon Stan and at least has a good reconciliation between Stan and Steve, but overall, It's another Steve and Stan episode, but this time featuring Barry of all people. That's right, folks, it's a Barry episode. We get a Barry episode before we get a Toshi or even a Snot episode, and honestly, it's a really solid episode. Steve is bored by Stan's work, and Stan, in turn, feels rejected by his son. Meanwhile, the B story is Haley protesting for Eskimo rights, with Roger using it as an excuse to run off to the community college campus and get wasted, and after downing an entire keg Stan solo, he becomes an honorary pledge. When Steve has Barry over and he actually shows some interest in what Stan does, Stan quickly attaches to how interested he was, even taking him to the Mint instead of Steve. Stan then tells Barry he doesn't need his vitamins, which is his greatest mistake he could ever make. See, Barry is psychotic without his meds, and takes on this weird British accent. He would go on to frame Steve to steal his family away from him and send him to an oil refinery turned reformatory. Steve has to use his dad's techniques to escape and prove that Barry is the problem after Barry buries Francine alive. It's a good episode for showing Steve learning to appreciate Stan's knowledge and actually learning something from him, as well as adding some depth to their relationship. Barry also gets some development that gets touched on. The Roger and Haley B story doesn't really go anywhere and it just kind of spins its wheels, but ultimately it's a good 7.5 out of 10 episode. And here we are, the season finale. It's Francine's birthday, and what does she want for her birthday? To break George Clooney's heart for stealing the scene in a TV show she was on. And Stan decides to help her make her dream come true by flying her out and coming up with a giant ornate plan to take him down. The B story has Haley getting sick while Roger and Steve start up a winery in the backyard while Stan and Francine are away. Of course, Stan ends up becoming friends with George Clooney and tries to sabotage the plan as a way to maintain his friendship. It's an awkwardly dated episode since Clooney has since gotten married, and fun fact, Richard Kind, the voice of Tuttle in American Dad, is actually a real-life friend of George Clooney famously. Just a neat fact. Ultimately, it's a great episode and a wonderful way to wrap the season, showing how much Stan really does love Francine at the end of the day, and is willing to travel across the world to make her wildest dreams come true. It's a solid 8 out of 10 conclusion to the whole of the first season. A much more poignant conclusion than, say, Deacon Stan, Jesus man. And there we go, we are done! Ultimately, what a ride this has been. Looking at the pilot and then at Tears of a Clooney, it is night and day where the series was and where it's going. There's also been less and less commentary as the show has gone on, and it'll only get better from here. Whew, I'm sorry, this has just been... this has been a struggle to get through. This was the biggest chunk of the show we're going to be tackling at one time, and there's just so much more that we get to cover. I just want to thank all of you for making it this far. If you're interested in seeing where the series goes, please make sure to subscribe so you get notifications whenever a new video comes out. Hopefully I should have these coming out pretty frequently, and we've also got a Twitch where I've been doing some streaming, and a Discord so that we can all engage and talk about our favorite episodes, or any anime news that matters to you. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time for Season 2 proper, the season when things really take off, and has some of my favorite episodes of the entire series. Thanks so much for watching, everybody.